The first sight that greeted the German prisoners of war arriving at the Norfolk Naval Base in June 1943 was not the grim militarism or racial purity they had been taught to expect, but a bewildering spectacle of American pragmatism. As the U-boat survivors and captured Afrika Korps soldiers disembarked, they were immediately faced with the systematic demolition of core Nazi myths. White and black dockworkers toiled subicida, concept of racial integration, however incomplete. In the wider U.S. that was unthinkable in the Reich, and forbidden by Nazi law. Women, not confined to the kinder, Kirche, dogma, operated heavy machinery, including towering cranes, dressed in practical overalls, commanding an authority alien to their ideology. The entire installation, a critical piece of the American war machine, seemed utterly relaxed. Civilians freely moved near military assets, and ordinary vendors sold coffee and newspapers on the streets. The scale of the port alone was staggering, dwarfing the weekly capacity of major German harbors like Hamburg. Yet, the most unsettling factor was the pervasive atmosphere of normality and quiet confidence. There was no visible paranoia, no desperate effort to hide the populace or the industry. The POWs, having been indoctrinated to believe America was a decadent, chaotic, and weak nation, were instead witnessing a society robustly and confidently mobilizing for war while retaining its domestic freedoms. This initial glance, the sight of everyday women in power and men of all races working together, was more corrosive to their ideological worldview than any battlefield defeat could have been, setting the stage for a dramatic psychological transformation. They were prepared for brutality. They found bustling, integrated efficiency. The processing of the newly arrived prisoners immediately violated every expectation they held about enemy captivity. Instead of the Gestapo-style interrogations and harsh treatment anticipated from the propaganda machine, they were met with meticulous professionalism guided by the Geneva Convention. American officers, speaking fluent, precise, German, read them their rights, explaining the rules of their internment with almost disarming politeness. Medical care was another profound shock. Wounded prisoners were given immediate and high-quality treatment, including doses of Penicillin, the miraculous drug, almost entirely absent from German field hospitals, where shortages were acute. The quality of care they received was, in many cases, superior to what was afforded to many American military personnel due to the immediate priority placed on compliance. Furthermore, the Americans asked about their dietary needs, even accommodating specific religious or cultural requirements, treating them not as subhuman enemies but as regulated combatants. This stark adherence to international law demonstrated a fundamental moral difference between the regimes. The Nazi expectation was that the weak American democracy would behave like the totalitarian state it fought, using barbarism against barbarism. Instead, the enemy showed restraint, organization, and a level of material capacity that allowed them to treat their captives humanely. This act of structured, well-resourced adherence to protocols signaled a quiet confidence in their system that no amount of screaming propaganda could overcome. The experience of sharing the mess hall was perhaps the most psychologically disruptive event in the early days of their captivity. Having been told they were fighting a war for racial and ideological survival against an enemy intent on their total destruction, the German posts found themselves standing in the same chow line, eating the same high-quality food as the American sailors who had just hours or days earlier been trying to kill them. There was no visible hatred, no taunting, and no deliberate segregation of the food or facilities. The quality of the meals was a minor luxury compared to the grim wartime rations of the German homeland and was equivalent to what the American enlisted men were receiving. However, it was the indifference of the American sailors that delivered the most stinging psychological blow. The Americans were far more interested in listening to a baseball broadcast over the loudspeaker than they were in the captured enemy. This casual focus on domestic life, a sporting event over, the immediate presence of their defeated foe, demonstrated a lack of existential panic. It suggested that the war, while important, was merely a necessary operation, not the life-or-death struggle for national survival that the Nazis had framed it to be. This encounter completely redefined the power dynamic. The Americans' strength lay not in their animosity, but in their capacity to compartmentalize the conflict and maintain a normal domestic life, suggesting a depth of security and abundance that Germany could only dream of. The subsequent journey inland, transporting the prisoners by rail to the interior camps, added further layers to the cultural shock. Unlike the cattle cars used for troop and prisoner movement in Germany, the posts were transported in cushioned, upholstered passenger carriages, a minor comfort that symbolized a broader respect for life. Critically, there was no attempt at concealment. The trains moved openly across the American landscape, often stopping in full view of the civilian population. This transparency was baffling. In wartime Germany, the movement of military assets and prisoners was a state secret, guarded by draconian laws. Yet, here, the windows were not even fully blacked out, allowing the prisoners an uninterrupted view of the country. Crowds of curious civilians gathered at stops, observing the German soldiers, but without hostility or fear. They were spectators, not antagonists. This lack of security paranoia, the absence of an Iron Curtain mentality, spoke volumes about the American leadership's confidence in its own internal security and, more importantly, the loyalty of its populace. To the German soldiers, conditioned to believe that state security required total secrecy and control, this openness was initially interpreted as foolishness or a deliberate trap. It ultimately dawned on them, however, that it was a demonstration of the power of a free society so secure in its structure that it did not need to hide its reality from itself or its enemies. As the trains wound their way through the American heartland, the prisoners bore witness to an economic reality that delivered a profound cultural and ideological shock, the sight of unbridled abundance and casual waste. In cities like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they observed shift changes at factories, where the workers, the very proletariat, the Nazis claimed were oppressed, emerged, wearing wristwatches, carrying fine lunch boxes, and driving private automobiles. The sheer volume of cars in the factory parking lots alone suggested a level of personal wealth unimaginable to the average German citizen during the war. One particular incident became legendary. A German officer watched a construction worker casually discard an apple that was only half eaten, simply because he wanted a fresh one. This act of throwing away perfectly good, edible food, a luxury in resource-starved Germany, where citizens were constantly reminded to recycle and save every scrap, was more demoralizing than any propaganda leaflet. It was a tangible, undeniable sign of a nation operating with an overwhelming and effortless material surplus. The Nazi belief that America was a financially fragile, struggling entity collapsed under the weight of this material evidence. The prisoners realized they were fighting a country whose economic engine was not merely robust but almost infinitely self-renewing, capable of sustaining massive military and civilian consumption simultaneously. The destination for many of the posts was the interior of the country. Camps like Camp Hearn in Texas, which quickly became known for living conditions that defied the prisoners' worst fears, and in many cases surpassed the quality of life they had known as civilians. The barracks were not tents or crude shacks, but sturdy wooden structures equipped with electric lights, indoor plumbing, flush toilets, and hot water facilities that many German homes, particularly in rural areas, lacked. Each prisoner received an individual bed with a mattress, a significant luxury. Crucially, the provisions exceeded the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention. The camps featured extensive recreational halls, complete with ping-pong tables and well-stocked libraries. This comfortable environment immediately diffused the kind of desperate hostility that breeds rebellion. The guards were instructed to maintain order but not to harass the prisoners, and the overall atmosphere was one of disciplined, yet comparatively relaxed, internment. The quality of the food remained high, ensuring the men were well-fed and healthy. This experience fundamentally altered the narrative of the war. The German soldiers were prepared to suffer for their defeat, but instead, they were housed in relative comfort by the enemy. This deliberate choice by the American government to treat the prisoners humanely and even lavishly was a powerful, nonverbal statement about the nation's values and resources. One of the most paradoxical features of the camps was the element of self-governance afforded to the prisoners. Within the boundaries of military rule, the Germans were permitted, even encouraged, to organize themselves. They elected their own Vertrauensmann spokesmen, managed their internal schedules, organized classes, and even enforced their own hierarchy. To the ardent Nazis, among them, this was interpreted as either a naive and foolish vulnerability on the part of the Americans, or a sophisticated psychological tactic. To the more pragmatic prisoners, however, it spoke of a profound confidence. The American command essentially communicated that they did not fear the enemy's capacity for organization because the war was already won, and the physical walls were sufficient. This degree of autonomy in captivity was unprecedented for many of the soldiers, who were used to the rigid, top-down authoritarianism of the German military and political system. By granting this freedom, the Americans subtly introduced the concept of democratic participation and self-determination into the daily lives of the prisoners. They were forced to negotiate, compromise, and manage their own community affairs, inadvertently practicing the very civic responsibilities that were crushed under the totalitarian boot back home. This experience of empowered self-rule provided a blueprint for post-war societal structure. The re-education project was the intellectual heart of the American strategy, a carefully calibrated effort to win the ideological war by exposing the prisoners to the very culture the Nazis had forbidden. A dedicated effort was made to stock camp libraries with thousands of volumes, including the works of banned German authors such as Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, and Jewish writers whose literature had been purged from the Reich. These books offered an alternative perspective on German history and culture, free from the nationalist filter of the Third Reich. Furthermore, the camps hosted extensive educational programs, hundreds of POs enrolled in correspondence courses, often offered by accredited American institutions like Sam Houston State Teachers College, covering subjects ranging from history to agricultural science. These courses did more than just pass the time. They opened academic and professional pathways that many had abandoned for the war effort. The key was that participation was voluntary. The Americans were not forcing dogma, but offering opportunity. They presented democracy and liberal thought not as mandatory obedience, but as a chance for intellectual and personal growth. This strategic commitment to education was based on the belief that once exposed to alternative ideas and given the tools for critical thought, the foundations of Nazi ideology would crumble on their own merits. The labor program served as a physical classroom for American capitalism and racial diversity. Due to wartime labor shortages, thousands of German POs were put to work in industries and, most notably, on vast agricultural enterprises like the King Ranch in Texas, which was larger than the state of Rhode Island. Here, the German soldiers worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and some black laborers. This direct interaction immediately contradicted the Nazi-propagated idea of racial hierarchy. They were forced to take orders and cooperate with the very people their government had deemed inferior in the fields and factories. They witnessed the astonishing efficiency of American mechanization, massive harvesters, and even small aircraft used to manage cattle, a stark contrast to the often labor-intensive, human-driven agriculture of Germany. In a crucial psychological moment, at an Alcoa aluminum plant, prisoners tasked with collecting scraps saw more valuable industrial waste thrown away in a single day than the entire weekly output of some German aircraft factories. Similarly, in food processing plants, they saw perfectly edible produce discarded due to minor cosmetic defects. These experiences working in mixed-race crews and observing industrial and agricultural output that treated scarcity as irrelevant demonstrated, far more effectively than any lecture, the true scale of American power and the fallacy of the Nazi economic model. Nothing was more indicative of the American sense of security and freedom than the information the prisoners received. They were given access to American newspapers and radio broadcasts, which reported on the war and, shockingly, contained open and fierce criticism of the government. They read articles attacking President Roosevelt's strategy, reporting on industrial bottlenecks, and questioning the efficiency of military decisions. To the German mind, where any form of public dissent against the Führer or the war effort was an act of treason, this was an alien and bewildering concept. The prisoners watched, mystified, as the 1944 presidential election campaign unfolded between Roosevelt and Dewey. They saw Republican politicians openly and vehemently criticize the conduct of the war without fear of arrest or consequence. This spectacle fundamentally challenged the totalitarian belief that a strong, unified state required absolute conformity. Instead, they witnessed a democracy in which robust, even acrimonious, internal debate was not a sign of weakness, but a mechanism for self-correction and a source of inherent strength. The understanding dawned that a government that allowed its people to freely criticize it was one that ultimately rested on the willing consent of the governed, a power far deeper than military might alone. The ultimate ideological breakdown for many prisoners occurred during the Christmas of 1943. While the German population faced severe rationing and fear, the American townspeople surrounding the camps mobilized with a shocking display of wartime generosity towards their enemy. Local churches and community groups, despite having sons and husbands fighting overseas, collected and wrapped thousands of individual gift packages for the German posts. Even American veterans of World War I contributed cigarettes and athletic equipment to the current enemy. The prisoners were treated to a colossal Christmas feast often, including a pound of roasted turkey per man, pies, and ice cream, a 5,000-calorie meal that stood in stark contrast to the meager 1,200-calorie daily ration of German civilians. The emotional climax came when local American mothers, women whose own children were fighting the Wehrmacht, gathered at the camp to sing German Christmas carols. This act of profound, unconditional kindness, this demonstration of benevolence, was too much for many men. It caused hardened soldiers, who had faced battle and death without flinching, to break down and weep. It was a tangible, human refutation of the Nazi doctrine that reduced the enemy to an inhuman, evil abstraction. The racial landscape witnessed by the German posts was one of the most confusing and contradictory aspects of their time in America. While the Nazi ideology rested on a foundation of absolute racial hierarchy, the Americans presented a baffling dichotomy. On one end, the Germans had been processed and sometimes guarded by African American soldiers, a scenario that was legally and ideologically impossible in Nazi Germany. On the other hand, the posts often witnessed the Jim Crow system of segregation. They would be taken into a town on a work detail and, if allowed a break, could eat at a local diner that explicitly refused service to their own Negro guards. This visible, entrenched segregation confused the German prisoners, who were constantly debating American values. Was America truly an egalitarian democracy, or was it simply a more decentralized form of racial tyranny? This complexity was difficult to reconcile. It forced the prisoners to confront the internal contradictions of their democratic captors. Yet even this visible inconsistency contributed to the re-education process. It showed that America was a nation struggling with its own ideals, where change was a possibility and debate was ongoing. Unlike the enforced, static, and deadly racial hierarchy of the Third Reich, the long-term impact of the American POW experience proved to be the final, most decisive victory of the war. When the prisoners were repatriated, their ideological transformation became a crucial element in the post-war reconstruction of Germany. Statistics confirmed the successful operation. Escape rates were extraordinarily low, 0.52%, and nearly 87% of eligible prisoners volunteered for work duty. Crucially, post-war surveys revealed that 74% of the returnees held a favorable view of American democracy, and 61% supported the American-led Marshall Plan. Thousands of former posts later applied to immigrate to the United States. More importantly, those who returned to Germany carried the lessons of American efficiency, tolerance, and democracy into leadership roles. Hundreds of former prisoners became influential figures. 48 were elected to the Bundestag, the German parliament, and 312 went on to serve as mayors, teachers, and business leaders. They brought with them the blueprint for a democratic society learned in the prison camps, the importance of a free press, the strength derived from political debate, and the power of humanistic treatment. The American POW camps did not just contain soldiers. They inadvertently became schools for the next generation of German democratic leaders, ensuring the survival and success of West Germany as a key U.S. ally against the new totalitarian threat.